Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, even though I have to say I'm a little bit in a difficult situation as the last speaker of a conference that was very, very full in perspectives and covered so much ground. So I did actually have to change my approach a little bit. I spent a bit of time last night and this morning to change my presentation. It may be a bit bumpy. I hope you bear with me. I think most of us are researchers or were researchers in a previous life, so we're used to improvising, and that's what I will have to do a little bit, because otherwise I would be repeating so many things that have been said in much more eloquent ways by other people before. Okay, so let's get started. Maybe before I actually go into the topic, so the topic of the talk is research security, openness, and communication. Communication will really, as you will see, I mean, it's a cross-cutting topic. I don't think it's necessary to have a specific section on that. It creeps up all over the place. So I'll be talking about research security and openness, the tension between the two, how is this approached at EU level, European level, Horizon Europe, etc., and how we can move forward, all the different stakeholders to bridge the apparent gap or conflict, and maybe to understand and to realize that it's not necessarily a conflict, but maybe also offers many opportunities. So before I do that, I should say a few words about the European Research Council. I suppose those of you in the room or who may still be following online, many will be familiar with what the ERC is, what we do, but for the benefit of those that don't, maybe just a few words. So the ERC program is part of the EU Framework Program for Research and Innovation. It's currently Horizon Europe, 7-year big program that runs until the end of 2027 and will then be replaced by the next framework program, which we call FP10, even though I think the title is not actually going to change, or not significantly. So what does the ERC do? We support fundamental, excellent frontier research. We call it frontier research. We don't talk about fundamental and applied research anymore. In all fields of science and humanities, and our funding goes to individual researchers, individual PIs, and their teams. So it's very much investigator-driven, bottom-up, curiosity-driven research. Grants normally last about 5 years, and the funding is quite generous, depending on the career stage, 1.5 up to 3.5 million. But there's one scheme that I would like to single out that is on top of it, and that is our synergy grants. And synergy grants fund up to 4 PIs with their respective teams to work on a bigger topic in a synergetic way. That's where the name comes from. And the interesting thing here is that while the standard grants have to be based at an institution in the EU or an associated country, for the synergy grants, one of the PIs can also be based at a third country institution. That is, when this happens, most of the time it is the US or Canada or maybe some other Western country, if you wish. But a priori, China is not excluded. So there have actually been discussions quite recently whether maybe there should be restrictions on the participation of China in the synergy grants. Right now, there aren't, but we'll see what the future will bring. The interesting thing is also about the latest round of the synergy grants. We had actually participants also from Brazil, from Ghana, from Singapore. So it's really, there is really an international reach. The budget of the ERC over the 7 years of the framework program is about 16 billion, so it's quite a significant budget. And so for the remaining time, we have about 2.5 billion per year left. The program is implemented by a dedicated executive agency. It's an agency of the European Commission, but autonomous to some extent, and that's where I work. So I say that because also in the discussion it came up at one point where I had to say I don't work for the Commission, and I don't. We implement the program to the best of our abilities. We have a scientific council that sets the scientific strategy of the program, And that also includes issues such as open science, etc., to the extent that they are related to our programs. But we do not have a remit to get really involved in the broader policy debate. So that just as background, so that there are no wrong expectations also. Like, we are not directly involved in any discussions on research security or even very broad open science discussions, because that's quite simply in the remit of the European Commission. Okay, so research security. So we have been talking about this in several talks, and this is probably really not necessary at all, but I thought just as a reminder, because there was research security, knowledge security, dual use policies, etc. So maybe just as a reminder, in the Council recommendations of May 2024, the following definition was used, and I'll read it out very quickly. So refers to anticipating and managing risk related to undesirable transfer of critical knowledge and technology that may affect the security of the Union and member states, for instance, channeled to military or intelligence purposes in third countries, malign influence on research where research can be instrumentalized by or from third countries in order to inter alia create disinformation or incite self-censorship among students and researchers, infringing academic freedom and research integrity in the Union. So we had quite a bit of the discussion was actually on this question of academic freedom or scientific freedom more generally, and also research integrity, also in the talk yesterday about self-regulation of academia. And then the third point, also very important, ethical or integrity violations where knowledge and technologies are used to suppress, infringe on, or undermine union values and fundamental rights as defined in the treaties. So of course, this is a definition that was put in that document by the Council of the European Union, that is the member states. So of course, it is at that level. And for other actors, that definition will most probably, in most cases, look somewhat differently, as we have already seen in the previous interventions. So when you meet the person on the street, you talk about research security, there are probably two scenarios that might happen. First of all, they think, okay, research security, safety, you're talking about the safety of whatever chemical experiments, etc., etc. Of course, that's not what we're talking about. Or the other reaction is likely to be something like, okay, you're talking about military research, defense research. And as this definition shows, of course, it's broader than that. And in particular, then, when you go into dual use, again, I'm repeating what has already been said, things are not black and white. It's not always so easy to decide about, is something really purely for civil purposes? Very often at the outset of the research, you don't even know, because the results are unpredictable and you don't know what some smart person or machine or AI might be able to do with your research results in the future. So in Horizon Europe, there is now, in the specific program, I should say more exactly, up to now, it only funds civil research, and actually the application form, there is a tick box that applicants have to agree with, and that says, something like, I don't have the exact wording here, something like, I confirm that the research put forward in this proposal is purely for civilian purposes, and then it's spelled out explicitly in parentheses, military or defense research cannot be funded under Horizon Europe according to whatever article. So that's the situation up to now, but if you have been following the discussions, and there are many, many, many discussions and developments ongoing as we are here, things are moving forward at lightning speed. So with regard to Horizon Europe, which is the currently running framework program, the Commission came up with a proposal to open it up to dual-use research, and some parts of it, and also defense-related research. So, as always, the Commission has the initiative right, and then it's up to the co-legislators, the Council and the Parliament to decide what to do with it, and maybe to amend the program, yes or no. So, of course, this was kind of put on the table. Also, with regard to FP10, of course, to open up to dual-use research. And for Horizon Europe, for a possible amendment, that was met with skepticism. I should say that, of course, always, it's not just the politicians, it's not just the people in Brussels, in the Commission, Parliament, Council, etc., that discuss this, but all the stakeholders, of course, are very actively involved in all these discussions and write position papers and give input and basically have a voice. To what extent it's heard is a different question, but definitely have a voice in the discussions. So very recently, so this was actually on the 5th of November, an agreement has come about between the Parliament and the Council to amend the legal basis of the currently ongoing program, namely to allow funding for defense and dual-use projects under a specific part of the program, and that is the EIC, European Innovation Council, accelerator scheme. So it's one very specific scheme that supports companies working on breakthrough technologies. So it's not even just waiting for the next framework program to see how are things opening up. The mantra for years, Horizon, the framework program is all about civil applications. There's a lot of discussion and now also changes happening. Now, this was not accepted straight away, so there are geographic restrictions. There is a whitelist of countries, beneficiaries from which countries can actually be funded in this way, which includes obviously the member states, but also certain associated countries. And you would have guessed it, there is also a deal in the background about Ukraine. So Ukraine, institutions in Ukraine will also be able to access this funding under this scheme. And then there are also certain safeguards in case of entities that are controlled by other third countries. So there's a lot of hassling going back and forth between the different parties in coming to these agreements about to what extent the program should be extended, and then also how safeguards should be implemented. And as I already said, for FP10, the proposal that is on the table is to completely open it up to dual-use research funding. Of course, we still have 1.5 or 2 years of, well, 1.5 years of negotiations in front of us. So, of course, there is still going to be a lot happening in that sphere. So that was just about defense and dual use. And then, of course, there are also restrictions on entities from specific world regions, countries. And that is actually quite interesting because I don't think that unless you are in a collaboration where you are affected by this, many researchers who have European collaborators may not actually fully be aware of all the restrictions that are currently already in place. So we have restrictions to third country entities based on the topic, and that is specified then in the work program, and also the technology readiness level of the specific scheme or actions in place. And then there are also specific assessments really on a one-by-one basis. And of course, we have restrictions concerning Russia, Belarus, also entities in the occupied territories of Ukraine, but also in Hungary. And of course, this comes from different corners. Russia, Belarus is quite clear. Hungary is all about the rule of law. That is not entirely guaranteed in Hungary. So certain beneficiaries in Hungary are excluded completely from participating in Horizon Europe. And this is also, of course, in the context of research security, maybe not so much in the context of defense, national security, but certainly the other points that I had listed in the definition of research security in the recommendation from last year. And now about China. because we had this very interesting contribution about research in China and open science in China, I thought maybe I include this here specifically. Also because there is so much going on. So participation of Chinese entities in innovation actions has been excluded for quite some time. So this is not something new. This has been in place for a number of years. But now, and maybe some of you will have seen the article on Science Business, and I think there was also something in Research Professional. So the Commission is now publishing drafts of the work programs for the next year. Previously, it was all about leaking documents, and if you knew somebody who knew, and maybe you had connections in the Commission, you would get access to early drafts. This is no longer the case. Now the drafts are actually published openly. And the draft work program for 26-27 now introduces new restrictions, and basically it says, unless otherwise stated, legal entities established in China are not eligible to participate in Horizon Europe in research and innovation actions, which is basically most of the activities. And then there is a long list, a list of parts of the program where China can participate. But of course, all the kind of more sensitive areas are excluded. So that is, it's a draft, has not yet been adopted, the work program, but it's quite clear that somehow the screws are being tightened there. And also specifically public universities, other higher education institutions that are under the supervision of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology are completely excluded from Horizon Europe. And then, of course, there are other specific exclusions, like where we're talking about development of ICT, really very critical technologies, AI also. Okay, so I hope I didn't bore you too much with that, but I thought these were, because they're really very, very recent developments. So if you Google now about, I think the headline is something like half of Chinese institutions to be excluded from Horizon Europe or something like that. There was an article on Science Business either today or yesterday. So I think it's really very timely. Now, the Commission on its side is following up to the Council recommendations, and first of all, research security is a priority action in the ERA policy agenda for 25 to 27, which simply means that it receives really very dedicated attention in all kinds of developments concerning the European research area. And there's also a couple of initiatives to enhance research security in the EU that have been announced very recently. Again, this is just about, was 2 weeks ago. On 28th of October, there was the inaugural European Flagship Conference on Research Security taking place in Brussels. And you can already see inaugural. It means that it's actually intended to be a recurrent conference. I'm not sure now whether it's annual or biannual. And interesting here and important, even if it's not on the slide, this is not something that the Commission has said, okay, we want to have this big conference, I think 500 participants, invitation only. But this was really co-organized with a whole number of research stakeholders. So university associations, Science Europe, also as association of RFOs, research funding organizations, various other stakeholders that are concerned by this. So I think the list is like 12 or 13 entities that were involved. So this also in the context of, because part of my title is communication, as we have seen throughout the talks so far, communication, really exchange, dialogue is super, super important. It doesn't help if one entity that maybe has something to say in the sphere is pushing its own policies without involving stakeholders in the discussions to come up with solutions that are really acceptable to everybody involved and really take into account the interests of all the different stakeholders. So what has been proposed is a new European Center of Expertise on Research Security that should then be based within the Commission. There are not many details as to what all of this concerns. Most of this has actually been requested in the Council recommendations, and the Commission is now putting it into action. So the idea here is to really collect information, case studies, intelligence from different stakeholders, member states in particular also, to bundle all of this in one central place where then those who need to know can go and get this information, and where the expertise is actually located. And then a due diligence platform to help researchers assess risks of international cooperation. And I was thinking, when I had a look at the general annexes of this draft work program that I mentioned before, I think it's about 4 or 5 pages just about participation of third country actors in Horizon Europe, and all the different requirements and all the different exclusions and what is allowed here and what is allowed there. And I can imagine that it's becoming really exceedingly complicated for entities, individual researchers who want to take part in, now in this case in the framework program, but of course also in other funding programs, when the rules are so extensive and maybe not always very easy to understand. So I think this due diligence platform, where you can go and say, okay, I'm planning a collaboration with this entity in that country on this and that project under that and that scheme, to really get reliable information as to what you need to take into account, whether it's possible at all, and under what conditions. And this has been initial voices from the community, from stakeholders about these proposals have actually been quite positive. And then also a new common methodology for member states to test the resilience of their research performing organizations. Resilience, of course, is a topic that has been mentioned over and over again in the last 1.5 days. So I think this is also very important to come to a common methodology and not to have a patchwork. And important also, as you are probably aware, the ERA Act, European Research Area Act, is in preparation to be in place by the end of, well, I don't know to what the end, but during the course of next year, 2026. And there are there's public consultation ongoing. There was evidence, a call for evidence, etc., on a whole number of issues, also in the area of open science. And the announcement was that there will also be research security will also figure prominently in the ERA Act in order to provide legal backing for well, on the topic of research security. Okay, so this was about research security. Again, I hope it wasn't too academic, but I thought it might be interesting to get this view, even if this is really just a snapshot of everything that's been going on. I have to admit, I'm not totally on top of this. It's not really my day-to-day business, but once you get into it, it's actually fascinating. So I encourage you also maybe to look up some of these actions. Okay, openness. Openness, of course, is not just open science, but in any case. And again, everybody in this room will be familiar with the UNESCO recommendation and the definition of open science in that recommendation, but just to open up the topic, so to speak, as a reminder, what does this particular definition, and of course there are many definitions floating around, what does it say? Open science is a set of principles and practices that aim to make scientific research from all fields accessible to everyone for the benefits of scientists and society as a whole. Open science is about making sure not only that scientific knowledge is accessible, but also that production of that knowledge itself is inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. And I've put this in boldface in the original. It's not in boldface, but I've put it in boldface because I think this is really the most important part of it all. Inclusivity, equity, and sustainability. So I suppose all of you in this room, in the audience online, are more or less experts on open science. I don't need to repeat what has been repeated over and over again. A couple of bullet points just. So openness, of course, it goes beyond open access to publications or data, which is what in our daily lives, also as research funder, our grantees have to make their publications open access, have to make their data open access under the mantra as open as possible, as closed as possible. But of course, there's much more to open science. So of course, ideally what we want is access to all types of research output and transparency and collaboration at all stages of the research life cycle, not just at the very end, the final product, the article or the data set that are then sitting somewhere in a repository. There's a way to get there, and that way is really important. So we're talking about early sharing of results, even intermediate results, for example, via preprints. Now, I have something later on about the framework program and open science, but I do expect, and I don't know, as I said in the beginning, ERC, our agency, we're not formally involved in the policy-making process, but I would expect that preprints will have a more prominent role in the next framework program. PRC, the Publish, Review, Curate approach, where publications are first put online and then reviewed and then curated. I think that is also something that is gaining traction, of course, also with Open Research Europe that we already heard about before, a Commission initiative that is now being handed over to the community. Open peer review in general, these are, of course, all very important aspects of openness that go beyond just open access in the old school kind of idea. Equitable publishing models. I think there are a few publishers in the room, and of course, this is something that you guys are interested in, I suppose, certainly some of you. I know because I personally, and also as representative of the ERC, I have been involved and am involved in a number of initiatives by some of the, let's say, more progressive publishers, so and their organizations. So I'm talking about OASPA, for example. At the recent OASPA conference, this was all about finding a way to provide access to publications in that case, but in a more equitable way than is currently happening, really to find a way to do it in a better way than currently through APCs, transformative agreements, which are all not equitable at all. Very important, open infrastructure. And specifically this morning, we heard a lot about infrastructure, and that is also part of the considerations concerning openness, open science. Open research information was also mentioned. I think, Matt, you had it on your slide. The Barcelona Declaration, this is then, of course, linked to research assessment, where I could open a totally new can of worms, but we don't have time for that, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm probably talking to the converted, but I think it's important to be aware of all these many different dimensions and facets of openness and open science. And specifically about open infrastructure, I thought it might be worth spending a minute or two on the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, where actually these were first published, I think 2015, something like that, and there was a revision. And now, again, October 2025, this is really hot off the press, a new version has been published. And it's, if you are not aware of them, I encourage you to have a look, or just Google for it, POSI, the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure. So these are just a couple of points from that list of those principles. And for example, POSI addressed governance, about coverage across the entire scholarly enterprise. So really, there are many different partners involved in scholarly activities, scholarly publishing, etc., and that really the governance should include all of them, stakeholder governed, basically. And also what I found very interesting, the living will, so successor planning. You may be aware of that in completely different everyday contexts, but it's actually formulated like this in POSI. Because, and this is relevant also in the context of research security, because it's all very nice when we say, okay, we make sure that our data are safe, secure, restricted access, etc., etc. But if they are hosted in infrastructure where you're not sure, is that infrastructure still going to be around in a couple of years' time? Under whose control? What will happen to those sensitive data? If there is no succession planning, if the governance or if the infrastructure may need to close down, wind down for whatever reason, what will happen to those data? So I think this is a very relevant aspect also in the context of research security. Sustainability, of course, we had a couple of interventions from the audience also on this topic, and I think it's super, super important. I don't know whether the colleague is still there, yes, about time-limited funds to be used only for time-limited activities. So if the idea is really to run activities on a long-term basis, they should not be project-funded. We need to find better ways of funding this very important infrastructure in a way that doesn't depend on 2, 3, 4, 5-year projects. And this is really critical. Also, maybe that infrastructure should think about generating surplus and making sure there are some financial reserves, but of course guided by policy. And if revenue are generated, then that should be generated from services and not from selling data. So that is also part of the principles. And the final point, insurance. Of course, open source infrastructure should, to the best extent possible, be open source. I know it's not always 100% possible. This was also interesting to hear in the context of OLS-PUB, that the emphasis is really on open infrastructure. Open and secure data accessibility within legal and ethical constraints. We should not be naive. There are constraints, and this again gets to the tension between research security in the broad sense, in the sense of the definition that I had before, also about ethical constraints, very important, and prioritize interoperability and open standards to ensure continuity and resilience. And there you have it again, the word resilience, which has creeped up over and over again today. Super important to ensure that our infrastructure is resilient. Okay, I promised I would say a few words about open science in Horizon Europe and also maybe for the future, FP10. So of course, I suppose you're all aware, open science is a cornerstone of Horizon Europe. Primarily, currently it's about open access to publications and data. But in Horizon Europe, in comparison to the previous framework program, we have also, or the Commission has introduced the requirement to use trusted repositories, and that links in to what I just said before about infrastructure. It's all very nice when we tell grantees they have to put their data into a repository that in 2 years' time will no longer exist. Open science is part of the evaluation criteria, at least in most programs. Of course, in the ERC program, it's not an evaluation criterion as such, because scientific excellence is our only criterion, but it's evaluated in an integrated manner. If it contributes to the excellence of the methodology, then of course it is evaluated positively. Now in the FP10 proposal, currently we only have a proposal. We don't know how that's going to be fleshed out. It will still probably change quite a bit over the next year and a half. But what we see and what is very reassuring is that open science remains one of the horizontal principles in the regulation, and is also an operational objective in the specific program. But of course, the devil lies in the details, so the model grant agreement always is a big chunk of work that goes back and forth, and that model grant agreement finally really decides how open science principles will be reflected in the actual, the way the projects have to run. And what is quite clear that with all the focus on research security in the broader EU policy, that will almost certainly also have an impact on how these open science principles will then be put into practice. So I have one last slide. I'm almost done, because also basically what has been said here, again, has in principle already been said. We need clear policies, frameworks, guidelines at all levels. At the EU level, of course, I said something about that, but also national, regional, sectoral. By sectoral, I mean, for example, one thing I found interesting, Jeroen is not here anymore, but Science Europe, as you know, is also bringing together research funders and research performing organizations, and they have been quite active on this, in this sphere, and also organized several workshops and come up with a report from that workshop, also with recommendations to their members, etc. Different university associations, like CESAR, for example, also has issued a position paper. They were also one of the co-organizers of that recent flagship conference in Brussels that I mentioned before. And then it trickles down sometimes at the institutional level within departments, because they have a specific focus, you need special guidelines. All that needs to be absolutely clear and transparent, because if the rules are not clear, you cannot expect that people will abide to them. Institutional support, and what is important, and again, this has also been said several times, both research security and open science have to be embedded in research culture. They have to become part of the day-to-day doing research, and not, now I do my research, and in the end, oh, did I tick all the boxes, all the stuff that I need to do, be it on the side of security or open science. So it should not be an afterthought. And that means, of course, also that the topic needs to be anchored at the top institutional level to really get the buy-in from everybody concerned. And I think it should really focus on the coexistence and mutual reinforcement of these two aspects, instead of just highlighting the potential perceived or actual conflict between the two topics. Awareness raising, education, training of researchers, early career researchers, but, and I want to stress that also, and maybe in particular, senior researchers who may be inclined to say, this is the way we've always done it, why should I change my course of action now? So I think that's important, but of course also support staff, both at the RPOs, research performing organizations, so universities, research centers, and also at the funders. And I think there, also in my own organization, we still could do better than that. And then there are the obvious technical measures. You don't send sensitive information by ordinary email, but again, be careful, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we all move to Microsoft Teams, maybe we'll end up having another problem in the end. And as always, especially in such a fast-moving area, it's super, super important to stay on top of things and to continuously evaluate and adapt the strategies that we have in place, simply because what might be adequate today may not be the right way to do things tomorrow. And with that, I close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I assume there might be questions over there.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. Regarding China and the new regulations, is it possible to tell how many of the previous projects that were funded that may have had involvement of Chinese institutions would be eligible or non-eligible moving forward? You know, it seems to me that the list of exclusion to exclusion criteria is pretty long. You know, for lots of reasons, one might justify that any of these exemptions might apply. So I'm just curious, what might be the range?
But to answer your question, whether it's possible, yes. But I'm not the right person for this question, seriously, because I mean, I can look it up, of course, but it's not something that I would have at the tip of my fingers. If you can believe the headlines, and quite often you can't. It will significantly reduce the number of institutions that will be able to participate. There is this, I should have noted this down, this whole group of universities, it's gone, that was previously eligible and is no longer eligible because of connections also to military military research or connections to entities that are involved in that sphere. Honestly, I'm not an expert on this. But one thing that has also been highlighted in the recent communication is also an approach of artificially merging civilian and military strategies so that it becomes more difficult to disentangle the two. But really, this is, it's not my area. Maybe actually exactly, I was just going to say maybe the colleagues who actually deal with China and know the Chinese environment much better can maybe comment on this.
Yeah. Maybe Anna has something to say to this, but unfortunately I don't know either. However, thank you so much for the interesting presentation and also especially for adding the China parts in it. My question is related to the open science part of the presentation, and yes, how do you see ERC's position in terms of enforcing or fostering open science? So you mentioned the evaluation criteria of Horizon 2020, but are there other ways how you are aiming towards really, well, you understood my question.
Yeah. Okay, first of all, in terms of rules, the same rules apply to us then as to the rest of Horizon Europe that is handled by the Commission, by the other agencies, etc. So, our council can really only, by the legislation, the remit is setting the scientific strategy. And of course, there you can say open science is part of the scientific strategy. It's a bit of question of how you interpret this and how active you want to become in that sphere. You said, yes, there are the Horizon Europe evaluation criteria, which we don't apply in the same way. However, one thing that we always stress is open science we will only get buy-in for open science practices, get our researchers to practice really according to what we preach, if this is reflected in the way they are assessed. And that is, of course, not only by us. I mean, yes, we assess them and their projects when they apply to us, but afterwards they are based at an institution, at a university, at a research institution. So that is really the only way really to make sure that open science progresses, if we work, if we encourage institutions also to take open science principles into account in their evaluation procedures. On our own side, the Council has carried out a big review of our application and evaluation processes about 2 years ago. It started 3 years ago. It actually started in the context of the discussions on the initially Commission initiated, but then taken over by the community discussion on advancing research assessment, so which then led to the creation of COARA. And the ERC Scientific Council has also signed up to the announced, don't know, it's not a declaration, but anyway, to the principles of the advancing research assessment. We're not a member of COARA, but not because we don't think it's a good thing, but for a whole number of other reasons, including to what extent the ERC, which is not a legal entity, can even become a member of something. Yes, well, I don't know what else I can say. The discussion is ongoing. Yeah, now I have to be careful what I say. I'm a bit sad to see that we used to have an open science working group for many years, and that has recently been changed into something more loose, to put it this way. I'm not very happy with that, but it's quite simply priorities change over time. It doesn't mean that open science is no longer a priority for the Council, but they want to approach this now in a different way, and hopefully maybe more in an integrated way, integrated in other discussions.
Thank you.
There was another question.
Yeah, thanks for the insights. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, working for EOSC infrastructure for more than 10 years, I'm very skeptical that we will have a sustainable one, an open one. And I mean, this is the pillar for anything that is open, so I'm very skeptical about that. My question is a kind of personal one. I mean, you probably won't be able to answer, but please try. I've heard on several other conferences from the kind of Commission area this wording of maybe we should treat research data as national assets, right? So my question would be, how do you judge on probably a personal level the development of the European, everything, infrastructure commission, the research council? Is it going to be on a political level something like we in Europe as a European research ecosystem against, let's say, the US and China and Asia? Or is it going to be something like all the individual member states going back to national assets and national, like how will the cooperation continue to be? Would you be able to judge?
I don't think I'm in a position to say, to make any big statements about EU Commission policy. For one reason also, because I do not represent the Commission here. From my personal view, I don't think there's any way to go back to national policies in that area. I think we need to have a European policy. I mean, we do have European policies, and I think we also need to maybe even achieve more coordination, harmonization, maybe to some extent. Since you mentioned EOSC, of course, there was the EOSC symposium a week ago or something. I suppose you were there. Our president was in the opening panel, where there was a lot of talk about data sovereignty and the benefits and pitfalls of that. And I think that's exactly what we need to do. We always have to keep in mind, okay, maybe we need data sovereignty to some extent because it is an asset, because we also need to ensure that, especially when there is no reciprocity, the word reciprocity has, I think, not been mentioned yet. I think it's very important. But especially when it's not there, then we also need to be sure that we retain sovereignty over such assets like data. But of course, it also must not hinder international collaboration, which is so important. I mean, if you don't have data exchanges, for example, just think about AI developments. I mean, we already touched upon that to some extent, also about what was it called, data. Help me out. Colonization or something like that. Colonialism, yes. If you develop AI tools that are only fed with data from part of the picture, then, I mean, rubbish in, rubbish out. It's not going to, then the AI is also going to produce something that is biased in the same way as the input that you provide. So, yeah, it's all about finding the right balance. And obviously, I'm not the one to give the perfect answer to this. Sorry.
I think there's another question from the online audience.
Yes, it says, will there be an assessment by the EC of the resilience of research infrastructure and information infrastructure in particular?
Again, I'm not the person to answer this, but I would assume that this is on the radar. I mean, with all the talk that is ongoing, if and how that would, what that would look like more concretely, I can't tell. I'm not the right person for this question. I'm sorry.
Any more questions? So if that's not the case, many thanks again.